Today we're going to talk about the Federal Aviation Regulations, or the FARs as pilots like to refer to them. I have a lot of ground to cover here, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but today I'm going to talk about who issues and revises the Federal Aviation Regulations and where they're taken from. I will then talk about two important titles that are pertinent to general aviation pilots and pilots in general. Part 830, which is under Title 49, and then I'll walk through some specific parts. Part 1, definitions, Part 61, Part 67, 91, 119, and then back to Title 49 to talk about Part 830. Then I'll talk specifically about 61 and 91, and I'll just go through those quickly. So as I mentioned, the FARs are issued and revised by the U.S. Department of Transportation. They are taken from the United States Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR as the pilots like to refer to those. Now there are two titles that are pertinent to pilots, and it's Title 14, which is Aeronautics and Space, and Title 49, which is Transportation. It covers not only aviation transportation, but transportation in general. Now this is the paperback or text version of the Federal Aviation Regulations, and I'm also going to cover here in just a moment the electronic version, which is the online. I'll help you navigate through that better so it won't be as scary of an event. So as I've mentioned, two titles that are important to us. I'm going to go ahead and talk about some specific parts now, and I'll introduce you to the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. We're going to talk about Part 1, or the definitions. So I'm going to turn you around here. We're going to do a Google search, and as you can see, E-Code of Federal Regulations, Electronic Code of Federal Regulations comes up, and that's what we want. So then there's a box right down here. We're going to go Title 14, Aeronautics and Space, hit go. We want to get into Part 1, so they're by number here. So 1 to 59, Part 1. And here we can see definitions, and I'm just going to briefly go through this. General definitions. Now these are the definitions the FAA feels that pilots we need to know. What an administrator is, what a definition of an aircraft is, what the definition of an airship, air traffic, armed forces, auto rotation, calibrated airspeed. There's a whole list from A to Z of definitions that the FAA feels that are pertinent. Now I want to talk about 61, which is certification of pilots, flight instructors, and ground instructors, as you can see right here. So we'll go into that just briefly. It starts out with subpart A, and it just talks about, in general, duration of temporary certificates, expired certificates, change of name, things of that nature. Then it gets into more specific aircraft ratings, pilot authorizations, some foreign pilots it talks about. Then it gets into student pilots, private pilots, recreational, commercial, airline transport pilots, and all of the certification rules and regulations that deal with those specific pilots. Now, Part 67, medical standards and certification. We'll click on that. What this is here, this just says if you go for a first class medical, it gives the physician, the examiner, it tells him what standards you need to meet, and they're listed here, so you can read those for second and or third class as well as first class medical. Part 91, these are the general operating rules. General operating and flight rules is what it's called, Part 91. Let's scroll down here, and there it is. So we'll click on that. We'll get into that, and here's subpart A again, just general. Talks about dropping objects, careless operation, alcohol, ATC light gun signals, aircraft speeds, TFRs. It talks about basic VFR weather minimums, special VFR, VFR cruising altitudes. It gets into equipment. It also gets into special flight operations, maintenance. It goes on. So those are all the general rules that govern pilots in general and people that work in the aviation industry. So we need to be familiar with that. I'd like to now look at Part 119. So we'll go out here, go into this one. 119 is in that number range. So 119.1, certification air carriers and commercial operators. Now what this is, this just says that as a commercial pilot, I mean without a 135 operating certificate, there are certain things we can do to build time, and that's what 119.1 is all about. So student instruction, non-stop commercial air tours, ferrying flights, banner towing, aerial photography, firefighting, power line pipeline patrol. Now there's a lot of things in here that I haven't covered, specifics that apply to these, and there are some specifics, so you need to be familiar with those. Go ahead and read those over and get familiar with those. Now I want to go back all the way to the beginning. We're going to click down here and go to Title 49, which I mentioned was transportation. Click on that. I want to go to Part 830, and National Transportation Safety Board. Now what this is this defines what an incident is, what an accident is, and as you can see here, notification reporting of aircraft accidents and incidents. So what this is, it tells us if we need to, what we need to make an immediate notification to the NTSB or FAA about. And any aircraft accident, it defines that, it defines incident. And then, as I mentioned, any aircraft accident, and then I believe there are 7 incidences that, for example, flight control system malfunction, in-flight fire, aircraft collision, things of those natures need to be reported immediately. So go ahead and read over that and get yourself familiar with Part 830. Now those are the specific parts that I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to go back into Title 14. Now this is where Part 61 and Part 91 reside. And as you can see here, go into the 61 here and back to certification. Now I want to talk about some specific regulations, starting with 6123 to start with. So medical certificates. Now what this regulation is here, this just says for example, an ATP pilot needs to have a first class medical. It also defines who can operate under a second class medical, who can operate under a third class medical, and then the duration of those medicals. So that is important to us. Go ahead and read that over and get familiar with that. Now I'd like to look at 6156, and then we'll look at 6157. So I'm scrolling down here, 56, flight review. As you know, we need a biennial. If we have a check ride, that basically starts the 2-year clock over again. So it talks about that flight review and gives all the specifics in relation to the biennial flight review. Now let's look at 57, 61, 57, and recent sea flight experience. Now to carry passengers, as pilot in command, we need during the day 3 takeoffs, 3 landings, and at night 3 takeoffs, well, within the preceding 90 days I should say, and then same for at night, 3 takeoffs and landings within the preceding 90 days, done under night, and it defines what night is, and then as well as it talks about instrument experience, what you need to act as pilot in command. So that's very important. So go ahead and read through that. Now let's look at, we're going to go to 91, Part 91. Scroll down here to Part 91 again, and let's look at 103 just briefly here. 103 just tells us that there are certain things that we need to be aware of, and we need to, for any flight, runway lengths of intended use, if the aircraft has a POH with landing information available in the POH for our aircraft. Let's see. Let's look at 91-126. And this goes all the way to 91-135. And what these regs here, 91-126 to 135, what this talks about is how we conduct ourselves in each class of airspace. For example, left turns in the pattern, maybe certain speeds, emergency operations. So we need to be familiar with that. So go ahead and read through that as well. Let's now look at 91. We did 103. We did 126. Let's see what else. 103. We did 120. Well, we did 126 through 135. So now let's look at 91-151 here. Fuel requirements for flight in VFR conditions. This just says different for fixed wing versus helicopter. For us, it's fly to that airport of intended landing and then fly at normal cruise speeds for 20 minutes. So go ahead and read through that. Get yourself familiar with that. Now let's look at 91-203. And these are the required documents that need to be on board and in view to your passengers, which we have an acronym ARROW: Airworthiness, Radio Station License, Registration, Operating Limitations Book, and Weight and Balance Information. So go ahead and read through that, and that tells you about all that, but just remember the acronym ARROW for that. Let's now look at 91-205. Now what this is, we have an acronym for this as well, but this is for VFR day. These following instruments and equipment are required, as you can see right there. So CAMAS foot, C-A-M-A-S-F-O-O-T, you can go through and then just pick those out of here and kind of get that in your memory as to that acronym. But these are the equipment, or I should say the instruments and equipment that you need on board for VFR day. Then it goes into VFR night. Right here is the VFR night. And we have a PALS, P-A-L-E-S, that goes along with that. And then it goes into instrument, and we have one for that as well, and it's grab card. So go ahead and put those instruments with those letters and get familiar with those and commit those to memory. Now I'd like to look at 91213, or the MEL, minimum equipment list. And what this is, it basically just says that if you have a minimum equipment list for your aircraft, you need to look at that if you have inoperative instruments. So if you have an inoperative gauge, if it says you can fly, you can fly. If it says you can't, you can't. So if you have an MEL, go with that, and if not, you resort back to 91205. Now we've talked already about, I won't re-hit that again, so we've talked about 830, which was under Title 49. You just went back out here, hit Title 49, and went into 830, and that was the NTSB stuff. So I won't cover that again. So today we've talked about who issues and revises the federal aviation regulations. We've also talked about where they come from and how they get their jurisdiction, how they become basically laws for us. I've talked about the two titles. I've talked about the pertinent parts that I feel are pertinent for this lesson. And I've also talked about some specific 6191 regs, although there are many others that we need to be familiar with. But some ones pertinent for this lesson I talked about. I've shown you the electronic code here, and I've showed you the textbook as well. The textbook has a glossary, so it's very easy to circumnavigate through the FARs in the text version. And hopefully through this lesson you will feel a little less intimidated about the electronic version, and hopefully you'll be able to become familiar with these regs. Thanks for watching.